The UAE just quit OPEC after 50 years, and it's because they got too wealthy to play by the cartel's rules. When OPEC was founded in 1960, it was revolutionary. 5 countries, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, decided to stop letting Western oil companies dictate prices. Within decades, OPEC controlled 80% of the world's proven oil reserves and shaped global economics. But here's the catch. Membership came with rules. Strict production quotas meant each country agreed to pump only so much oil, keeping prices artificially high. For decades, this worked brilliantly. It made members wealthy beyond imagination. But those rules that once protected the cartel started suffocating its richest members, especially one that had learned to thrive on something other than oil. Here's what makes the UAE fundamentally different from every other OPEC member. In the 1980s and 1990s, while Saudi Arabia doubled down on oil extraction, the UAE leadership made a deliberate choice. They looked at their oil reserves, finite, and asked themselves a dangerous question. What happens when they run out? So they started building something else entirely. Dubai became the test case. They poured oil revenues into creating artificial beaches, luxury hotels, and a massive port. Then they built a financial district. Then they made it a tax haven for international business. By 2010, oil accounted for only 5% of Dubai's GDP. Today, tourism alone brings in more revenue than oil ever did. The Burj Khalifa, the Palm Islands, the Dubai Mall, these weren't built because OPEC told them to pump more crude. They were built because leadership recognized that controlling oil was less valuable than controlling trade routes, hospitality, and finance. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia still gets roughly 50% of government revenue from oil sales. They're trapped in the same dependency that made them rich decades ago. The UAE's entire economy had evolved past needing OPEC production quotas. In fact, those quotas became handcuffs. When you're generating billions from real estate and tourism, why would you accept restrictions on your oil output? That's the moment you realize you've outgrown the cartel. Here's where the relationship broke down. By 2024, the UAE's economy had fundamentally changed shape. Oil revenues, which once made up nearly 80% of government income, now represented less than 30%. Meanwhile, countries like Iraq and Venezuela were still pulling 90% of their government budgets directly from crude sales. That creates a massive problem inside a cartel. When OPEC sets production quotas, it's designed to keep prices high by limiting supply. That works perfectly if you're dependent on oil revenue. But the UAE wasn't anymore. Those quotas were actually costing them billions. Every barrel they weren't allowed to pump was a barrel a competitor could sell instead. More critically, those restrictions prevented them from investing in new oil infrastructure and exploring new fields, investments that would have locked in long-term profits and geopolitical influence. Think about it this way. Saudi Arabia needs OPEC to survive economically. The UAE needed OPEC to disappear so they could compete freely. By 2024, their interests weren't just different, they were mathematically incompatible. The cartel that created the UAE's initial wealth had become a prison for its ambitions. Staying in meant accepting constraints designed for countries that looked nothing like them anymore. So what actually happens when you leave OPEC? On the surface, it looks like a win. The UAE can now pump as much oil as they want without hitting the production ceiling that OPEC imposed. They can negotiate bilateral energy deals with countries like India and China directly, without coordinating through the cartel. They're no longer bound by the collective decisions that sometimes held them back from maximizing short-term profits. But here's the catch. They also lose the collective bargaining power that kept oil prices artificially high. When OPEC coordinated production cuts, they propped up global prices. The UAE benefited from that. They're competing on their own, which could mean lower prices overall. However, and this is crucial, the UAE doesn't actually care that much anymore. Their economy generates more revenue from tourism, real estate, and finance than from oil. Dubai's ports and airports handle more international trade than most countries' GDPs. That diversification is their real insurance policy. They're not leaving OPEC because they need more oil money. They're leaving because they don't need OPEC protection anymore. The cartel kept them constrained while they built something bigger. So here's what the UAE just taught us. Real wealth isn't about controlling one resource or playing by someone else's rules forever. It's about becoming so diversified, so independent, that you can walk away from the table entirely. The smartest billionaire move isn't winning the game, it's outgrowing it completely. The UAE didn't need OPEC anymore, so they left. That's the ultimate power move.